Ladies and gentlemen, Lewis Pugh doesn't really need an introduction, but that hasn't stopped me so far today, so I'm going to do another introduction. Lewis is an ocean advocate and endurance swimmer. Over a period of 30 years, he has pioneered swims in the most challenging environments on Earth, including the Antarctic, the North Pole, and the Himalayas. He's currently engaged on the long swim, so we're enormously grateful to him for being here right now. It's extraordinarily good of him. In 2013, the United Nations appointed Lewis as the first UN Patron of the oceans. In 2016, he helped negotiate the creation of the largest protected area in the world in the Ross Sea off Antarctica. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lewis Pugh.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much. It's absolutely wonderful to be here this afternoon. You'll probably be able to detect from my accent that I spent some of my childhood growing up in Africa. And one of the things which I love about Africa, one of the many things which I love about Africa, is that Africans, we love to tell stories. That's how we've connected since the beginning of time. That's how we have conveyed our messages. So what I want to do today is I want to tell you two stories. The first one is from the highest place on this earth, Mount Everest. The second is from a city which I absolutely love, Mumbai in India. And then I'm going to bring these stories back here underneath this tent and relate them to you and to ask you for some help. So let me start with the first story. Back in 2010, I went to Mount Everest to attempt to do the highest swim on this earth. You say to me, how on earth can you do a swim on Mount Everest? Well, the glaciers on Mount Everest are now beginning to melt, and so now there are lakes actually appearing high up on Mount Everest. And so I put a team together and we flew from London to Kathmandu, from Kathmandu to a small village called Lukla, and then we started a 2.5-week trek up to this lake on the Khumbu Glacier. On the way, we went past a lake where I did a test swim. I dived into the lake. I swam around for 8 minutes, no problems at all. And so the leader of the expedition, who used to be a general in the British Army, used to be the commandant of Sandhurst, General Tim Toynbee, he said, Lewis, I feel confident that you can go up onto Mount Everest and do this swim. And so we climbed for another 3 days. In altitude, we only went up another 300 meters until in front of us was this lake on Mount Everest. Now, for those of you who have seen me swimming, I always swim crawl. You know, when you are swimming on Mount Everest, you don't want to do backstroke or butterfly or anything daft like that. I swim a little bit aggressively just to be able to generate the heat, and I go as fast as I can. That's the way I've been swimming for 30 years. When you get in cold water, fast, hard, aggressive swimming. And so I'm standing there in front of the lake with my team. The general says to me, you ready? I say, I'm ready. And I dive into this lake and I start swimming across it as quickly as I can. In less than 30 seconds, I realized I had huge problems. I just couldn't breathe. I was gasping for air. We're at 5.5 kilometers above sea level. There's so little oxygen. Luckily, this lake was very, very shallow because at one stage I thought I was going to drown. I was able to push myself up from the bottom of the lake. I took a couple of deep breaths. I said to myself, keep on going, Liz, keep on going. I put my head down, I carried on, and then I saw from the corner of my goggles the general screaming at me to get out of the water, get out, get out. I got to the edge of the lake. I was virtually vomiting in the water. He pulled me out and he said, Lewis, it's all over. He said, I'm sorry, Lewis. He said, the way you are swimming now, you will drown in this lake and you'll just be another person that kills themselves on Mount Everest. He said, I'm taking you down the mountain right now. And so we walked down this pathway all the way to a little village called Gorakshep. We put up our tents. We spent 3 days there trying to get more oxygen into our bodies. After the second day, the general said to me, he said, come on, Lewis, let's go for a quick walk. So we walked down this pathway, and at the end of it, he said, Lewis, would you like to have another go at this swim? I said, yes. He said, I feared that would be the case. He said, if you want to have another go at this swim, you need to take a radical tactical shift. I said, what? He says, a radical tactical shift. He says, why are you trying to swim so quickly? I said, because it's so cold. I said, this is the way I swim. I swim fast and aggressively to be able to heat up my body. The water's freezing cold. He said, Lewis, he said, stop being so fussy, this water's warm. I said, it's 2 degrees. He said, Lewis, he said, you swam at the North Pole, which is minus 1.7. So stop being fussy. The issue here is not the cold. The issue here is the altitude and the lack of oxygen. He said, what I recommend you do is instead of swimming as quickly as possible, you swim as slowly as possible to save that oxygen. Instead of swimming crawl and you've got your head in the water, I recommend you start swimming breaststroke, and then you can breathe whenever you want to. But he said the most important thing, Lewis, is instead of swimming with all this aggression, which may have worked in the Cape of Good Hope, may have worked to the North Pole, he said, I recommend you start swimming with real humility. And he pointed up to Mount Everest and he said to me, Lewis, you cannot bully Mount Everest. And at that moment I realized how I would have to do this swim. We spent another day there, and then I get a knock on the side of my tent, and it's a young Nepalese Sherpa called Sanjeev. He said to me, we're going to go back up that mountain and we're going to do this swim. Now in the meantime, we have got an inflatable boat which has been brought all the way from Kathmandu to Lukla and been brought up on the back of a yak. We're now going to take this boat up Mount Everest. It would be fair to assume that we were the first people ever to try and take a boat up Mount Everest. It takes, for those of you who may be inclined to do the same thing, it takes an awful long time to get a boat up Mount Everest. But eventually we arrived back at that lake where I had nearly drowned 3 days previously. I remember looking out at it and just feeling this angst inside my stomach. You know, there's some people who say that drowning is the most peaceful death. Where on earth do people come with these type of notions? I was petrified. And Sanjeev saw me and he said, come with me, Lewis, come with me. And there's a rock over here. And we sat down on the rock and he put up these beautiful little prayer flags, as the Nepalese people did. And he said, I just want you to relax, Lewis. I just want you to, you're not going to get in until you're completely ready. And I saw as this team of Nepalese Sherpas left base camp and started walking along the edge of the Khumbu Glacier into the clouds and up onto the highest point on this earth. And it was incredibly peaceful. And I shook his hand and I thanked him. I shook the general's hand and I slowly got into the water. For the first 250 meters, there was no problem at all. For the next 250 meters, there was also no problem at all. I got to the 600 meter mark and I started feeling really cold. I got to the 700 meter mark, I was feeling absolutely frozen. I got to the 750 meter mark, I thought to myself, if I don't switch right now into crawl, I am going to die here on Mount Everest. Just as I was about to go into crawl, on the edge of the lake, I see Sanjeev screaming at me, slower Lewis, slower, slower. And luckily, I listened to him and I swam the last 250 meters as slowly as I could until I got to the end. Sanjeev ran into the water, he grabbed me, hugged me, gave me an enormous kiss. The general walked up to me and he didn't give me a hug or a kiss. I learnt a few really, really important lessons there on Mount Everest. The first one is very, very obvious. That is, just because something has worked in the past does not necessarily mean it'll work today, and certainly doesn't mean that it'll work in the future. The second lesson is also one about change. That is, you can change your speed, you can change your stroke, but for real, for effective change to take place, we have to be prepared to completely change our mindsets. Which brings me to Mumbai. For those of you who've been to Mumbai, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's one of the greatest cities on this earth. It's vibrant, it's exciting, it's a huge amount of people in a small space. 3 years ago, there was a young Indian lawyer called Afroz Shah. For those of you who perhaps met Afroz Shah or seen him on Sky News, you'll know what I'm talking about. He is one of the most exciting young men to come out of that city. He has a small apartment, a modest apartment, which looks out over Versova Beach. And every single morning, he would just see more and more plastic coming in with the tide. And eventually that plastic was shoulder height. Shoulder height. I don't know if any of you have actually walked onto a beach and seen shoulder height plastic. And then every morning, because this beach is right next to an informal settlement, every morning all the children and all the people go out. There are no public lavatories there. They go out, they do their defecation on the beach, and then they go back into their houses, and in the evening the exact same thing happens. And so this is a beach just full of plastic and feces and sewage, and this is just a few kilometers away from Bollywood, in one of the greatest cities on this earth. And he felt so moved by this that he decided with his neighbor to go down to that beach and start cleaning it up. And everybody laughed at Afros. But Afros is not the type of person that really cares what people think. He's just determined to fix this problem. He's a man of action. And he went down there that weekend and he cleaned on the Saturday and the Sunday. And he did a small little bit of the beach. And then the next week, just the two of them again. And it took about 20 or 30 weekends before a few more joined. And then a few more joined. And eventually, I met him on week 50. On week 50. I'd never ever seen anything like it. Now there were over 1,000 people down there. The only way you can clean this type of beach is with bulldozers and trucks. And we cleaned the beach from the beginning all the way to the end. And you know what? We came back on the Wednesday, and the pollution was just, the ocean was just vomiting more and more and more plastic. So unless we can actually stop it at the source, it's just going to come more and more and more. And he's now been doing this for 3 years. 3 years, every single weekend, Afros and the Versova Beach volunteers are down there cleaning these beaches. Which brings me back to this room, to you. I unfortunately came a little bit late because I'm swimming from Land's End to Dover, so I didn't hear all the speeches, but I did hear a few of them. It was inspirational to hear what is happening here in the southwest. As a young boy, I grew up in Plymouth. I'm very, very proud of my Plymouth roots. Plymouth is one of the greatest cities on this earth. It's a magnificent city. You think about all the great explorers and all the great adventurers, the sailors, what has come from Plymouth is magnificent. But I have a request for the people from the southwest. As the UN Patron of the Oceans, that we try and take all the knowledge which is in this room, and there's so much knowledge in this room, and we start helping, giving this knowledge to the people of India, giving this knowledge to the people of the Philippines, giving this knowledge to the people of China. Of the plastic pollution in our oceans, over 90% of it comes from just 10 rivers. Over 90% of it comes from just 10 rivers. 2 in Africa, the Niger and the Nile. The others are in Asia. Of those ones in Asia, 7 flow through China. And it's easy for us in this country to look there and say, you need to solve that problem, it's your problem. It's our problem. It's all of our problems. I urge you, let me end off now, I urge you to please think about what radical tactical shift you can take in your strategy, that you are able to give everything that you have learned here in the southwest, everything you've learned in the city and Plymouth, and help those people around the world to be able to ensure that their beaches and their rivers are clean and healthy, and their water is fresh and drinkable. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very, very much.